Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of the Pete Wargent Property Pod. I'm delighted to have a special guest on the podcast this week, Rosie Yeo, expert strategist and director of Public Affairs Network, and also the author of Go for Bold, How to Create Powerful Strategy in Uncertain Times. Rosie, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Hi, Pete. It's lovely to be talking with you today.
And just fresh back from a break, I believe.
Oh, you're right. We had 3 weeks off, a long delayed family holiday over in France and Spain. And I have to say, it was just so exciting to be out in the world again. Really loved it.
Yeah, you and half of Australia in Europe at the moment, I think. So there's a fair few Aussies knocking around. So I'll just run through a brief bio. So Rosie is the go-to strategist for boards, executive teams and business leaders with decades of experience in helping people to imagine and then achieve a better future. So Rosie's experience as a public affairs strategist, also a board director and corporate advisor. So lots of experience and unique insights into how organisations can design and implement big plans, based in Sydney, Australia these days, and also a keynote speaker and author. So, Rosie, where should we start? Tell us a bit about your background, and then we can go on to talk a little bit about strategy and how people can incorporate all of that.
Thanks, Pete. Well, look, I started off my working life actually in politics. I was a political advisor, first in federal politics and then in state politics. And, if there's ever a temptation to go short term, not long term, it's politics. But it was a great learning ground for me on how to look at things from many different perspectives. The importance of making the right decisions and factoring in a whole lot of considerations before you move forward. I then moved into managing public affairs for an industry association, and then ultimately as a consultant on my own, managing public affairs for a whole range of organisations. And along the way, because I'd done my MBA and I had a company director's diploma, I started facilitating conversations first around public affairs issues and government relations issues, and then more broadly than that. And also working as a director on a national regulatory board, I started to appreciate that sometimes these strategy sessions were not all they were cut out to be. You could walk into a strategy session and see people getting frustrated and bored and just wanting to get out of the room. And I sat back and thought, there has to be a better way. These should be the most important conversations and considerations we have. How can we be getting them so wrong? So that was when I started off on a journey to start working out how can we reinvent the way we talk about our future plans, to bring people on board, to get people excited and to come up with better ideas. And that was really where this journey's taken me to now. So now I facilitate strategic planning for lots of different boards and executive teams. And then I also facilitate more complicated conversations, whether it be large conferences where there are big policy issues to debate, or roundtables where government and industry and academia all come together to try and solve problems. So it's always a real privilege to be in the room, because you're in the room with people who are so knowledgeable, so experienced, and to actually inject a little bit of magic into those conversations and get more out of those conversations is what gets me out of bed every day.
Fantastic. So these days you're working with boards across Australia and Asia, and you're essentially helping them with their strategy planning. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about bad strategy days, because I was back in my youth, I was a director at one of the big accounting firms, and then I did some low-level executive roles in listed corporates. And I can remember some of the strategy days, they weren't necessarily terrible, but there was definitely sometimes a feeling it's a bit like a day off, from your normal job. But then halfway through the day, you start staring out the window, and then having coffee breaks every 5 minutes or pub lunch or whatever. But how do you structure a strategy day so that it's exciting or inspiring, and giving people the conviction to actually sort of, or courage to have some bold ideas and then go ahead and execute on them?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of different elements to consider. I mean, I think first, most people, when they're thinking about doing a sort of strategic planning day, they focus on the model, the framework. Which framework are we going to use? There's 100 different frameworks out there, and that's just last week's. And some of them are very complex. And what happens is people get so focused on which definition are we talking about? Is it a goal or a strategic objective or something like that, that they lose sight of the fact that a strategy day should be all about answering your big questions. So the more you can get clear about those before you even walk into the room, the easier it is going to be to have a valuable conversation. So I think a lot of the power of a good strategic planning day is all in the work that you do before the day, working out what are those big issues and what are the big questions we need to answer along the way. Now, of course, strategy frameworks answer those questions too, but ultimately at its core, your strategy is all about this shared story that you have. Who we are, who are we, where are we trying to get to, what's that shared long-term ambition, and how are we going to get there? How are we going to overcome all the hurdles along the way, and how we're going to maximize the opportunities we have and the resources we have to get there. And those sort of simple but important questions, if we structure a day around those, you're more likely to jump in a logical fashion rather than someone being stuck back at, yes, but what did we do 3 years ago? And someone else talking about, yes, but we need to set an agenda for the next, 20 years. You've got to keep everybody looking at the same spot at the same time. And I think you also need to make sure there's some trust in the room. Like we always talk about the fact that you'd never get on a plane if you didn't have confidence in the pilots, licensing and training. But we seem to think that just by being in a room and saying we're in a strategy day, we're all confident in each other's judgment. Like you don't have to be best friends, but you do need to have a level of professional respect and appreciation in order to have the confidence to make big decisions. Otherwise, you're sort of heading off into the unknown and you're not quite sure who you're going there with.
Yeah, absolutely. So now you have summarised a lot of this into your book, Go for Bold, which is subtitled How to Create Strategy in Uncertain Times, which we've definitely had plenty of over the past 2.5 years or so. So this is essentially a new approach to designing and committing to powerful strategy to achieve essentially the best possible. So tell us a bit about the book, and also where does the magic behind powerful strategy come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, to start with, I decided to write the book because particularly during COVID, I saw this thing happening in a whole lot of organisations where everybody lost focus on their long term. They either lost focus or they lost confidence in planning for the long term. Usually when you're working with corporates, we talk about a 3-year strategic planning horizon, maybe a 5 years. I've even worked on 20-year strategies. Love the government. But, over the past 2 years, so many of my clients were just saying, look, Rosie, we just need to focus on surviving the next 12 months and then we'll worry about the future. In one sense, that made absolute sense because so many organizations were really just trying to keep their head above water. But we can't stay fixed that way in the moment forever. And we're losing, as soon as you lose sight of your long term, it's much easier to wander off track and not be able to get back. So the first reason why I wrote the book was just to help people think about how can we accept, first of all, that we can't control everything, because that's always been the case. It's just that COVID has made it more obvious. And then once you've accepted that, okay, well, how do we then keep building the confidence to set long-term ambitions and figure out how to achieve them? So I think, just giving people the tools to have the confidence to still make those big calls and keep working towards those longer, bigger ambitions is, I thought, was a worthwhile thing. And also, like a lot of organizations and individual business owners, they don't have the resources to bring in an independent facilitator like me, who sort of works with a company and goes through a whole process over usually a couple of months of what are we trying to achieve? Let's get all the information together. Let's apply some imagination to it. So I just wanted to give individual business owners, other organizations, including nonprofits, just give them the tools to feel confident that they could have those conversations and make their own conversations better, even without an independent facilitator in the room.
Out of interest, you mentioned that governments can do 20-year plans, and I think I might be right in saying that some Japanese businesses have these grand 100-year plans, however useful they may or may not be. But how long would you consider to be a long-term strategy? Because one of the things we do at Buyers, we do 10-year property plans. But even then, you have to acknowledge that over the course of 10 years, a lot can change. I'm thinking back to what I was doing 10 years ago, and my life hasn't probably followed the same trajectory that I thought it might. And I'm sure it's the same in business. So how long would you consider to be a long-term strategy?
I'm going to give you two answers to that, because I think, first of all, like looking out to the long term, like say a 10-year horizon, is so important for setting that long-term ambition. When you actually come to doing a strategic plan, so working out some clear milestones along the way, I would say particularly these days, 3 years is pretty much as far as most organisations can come. But I do think that longer term ambition is really important. I often say to clients that time expands ambition. So the further out you're willing to set your objectives or set that sort of ambition, the more ambitious you can be. I mean, I could sit here and tell you that, Pete, I'm planning to run the Boston Marathon next month. And that's not actually an achievable ambition for me. I can tell you, I can barely walk that. I could barely walk 40 Ks. But if I was to say to you, look, I'm going to set an ambition for 3 years into the future that I'm going to run a marathon, all of a sudden that actually becomes possible. Because if I did actually set my, carefully do a training program and work out all the steps, then feasibly I could do that in 3 years. Now, the only thing that's changed is the time horizon. So I do think it's really important to give people the space to think about longer term horizons and set some ambitions. But then when it comes to actually the nuts and bolts of a strategic plan, I would say 3 years generally is good. Sometimes organisations can't look beyond 1 year, and certainly with some of my clients, they're sort of happy to look at a long-term ambition, but then they really do need to focus on the 1 to 2 year horizon right now because so much has changed.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
So you mentioned, in the subtitle of the book, Uncertain Times, and I think I must have mentioned on one of these podcast episodes before, about 3 years ago, I started learning Italian on the European theme with, I had some grand plans to go and stay in Italy and so on. And of course, COVID came along, the worst possible place I could have chosen on the planet. Italy was in full lockdown and obviously plans had to change. But actually, we get a lot of investors listening to this podcast, and whether it was in the stock market or property market, that people design long-term plans. Then there's a big disruption like COVID, and suddenly all those long-term plans go out the window, as you alluded to, because people are reacting to what's happening in the immediate term. So how can we go about making big long-term decisions with confidence when there's all this uncertainty in the world at the moment?
So I think, first of all, it is about maintaining that element of confidence that you can set your bold ambition and appreciate that sometimes things change. along the way. And you do need to, strategy is always, it's never fixed. So you do need to constantly keep reassessing where you're up to, whether you're confident that you understand what the hurdles and enablers are for your organization moving forward. But equally, holding on to that broader long-term ambition, that vision of what success looks like, helps you work out different pathways to get there. I often talk with leaders about the fact that you really do need to see strategy through two lenses. One is that just keeping a view on what your long-term ambition, that big ambition is, whether that's extremely specific or just a broader sense of what you want to achieve over the long term. But then also the short-term perspective on, figuring out what are your next steps forward, how are you going to get to the next milestones to get there, and being open to look at different pathways to achieve that ambition. And sometimes we do need to change our ambition as well. That's not out of the ballpark, but the clearer you are about your long term, the more open you are to also seeing other ways of achieving it. I think with strategy too, in order to, we sort of use the word strategy all the time. We make strategic decisions and we have strategic plans, and we don't always think what the essence of a successful strategy is. And part of being strategic is seeing the long term. So setting that shared long-term ambition that everybody in your organization or within your group understands and signs up to. But there's two other key elements you need to blend together to create this magic, powerful strategy. You do need information. We spend all our time in strategy prep coming up with PowerPoints and spreadsheets and all the data that we've got right now. And that's really important to have information, but you've got to blend that with imagination. Because if you're painting a pathway to a future that doesn't yet exist, like, this is the point of strategy. We have to invent it. And that requires creative thinking. And I think that's where sometimes we fall down a bit. It's not enough to have the information. We've got to blend it with imagination and that cleared sense of what that long-term ambition or that shared purpose is. And if you start blending that together, then you have some more fun with it, but you also become a little bit more open and flexible to adapting as circumstances change. The other thing that I think we all need to consider is that there are simple ways you can also sort of deal with uncertainty as well. One of the activities I often do with clients when they're saying to me, look, we just don't know, things keep changing. I'm like, well, map out your best case scenario and your worst case scenario in the external environment. Now, for each of those, imagine it over the next 3 years. What's the best case scenario in your operating environment? The worst case. And then from both of those scenarios, look at what would be the keys to success for your organization in either the best case or the worst case. And when you start mapping out the keys to success, you will find that there's a few keys to success that are the same, regardless of whether you're in best case or worst case scenarios. So focus on those. Focus on getting those right. And regardless of what happens in your external environment, you're going to feel a little bit more in control, and you're also going to have taken some steps forward to get further down the road.
Yes, I think you've preempted my next question, because it was really a dual question. Firstly, what does it actually mean to be strategic, either in work or in our personal life? And then how can we actually benefit from understanding strategy and using a plan in your personal and corporate life? So I guess reading from what you were saying there, I suppose a big part of the benefit is having a roadmap, but also more clarity and more confidence. Is that it, or is there more to it than that?
Absolutely, Pete. And, we don't often talk about the fact that we need to be strategic in our personal life. But I absolutely think there's a huge amount of value into being more thoughtful in the way we look at our own lives and how we want to achieve, our best lives as well. #. No. And I think part of the reason of being strategic in your personal life, all that means is, be clear about what your personal goals are and map out a pathway for how you're going to achieve those too. Use a bit of information, imagination, and that clear sense of purpose to think about how you can move forward in any aspect of your life. And I think one of the benefits of doing that is that you waste less time doing things that seem so important right now, but they're actually not contributing to where you want to get to. And I mean, we're all guilty of this, me just as much as everyone else. It's so easy to be swamped by all the stuff you need to do right now that that we all lose sight of what those longer term things that are really important to us. And I think also, if you've got that more strategic approach to your own life or your work, then you're less likely to be shaken when things don't work out exactly the way you planned, because you can still fall back on, what that long-term ambition is. Look at other pathways for getting there. It doesn't all fall over in that instant. And I think also, if you're clear about where you're trying to head, it's much easier to explain it to others as well and bring them along with you on the journey. And, if we're in relationships or families or friend groups or with business partners, it's so important to not do any of this on your own. Like having that shared story where people understand what you're trying to get to and where you're trying to get to, it can be so powerful, because then you can have helpful conversations with them along the way too about how you're making progress.
Well, we can all get caught up in the day-to-day minutiae of everything else that's going on in the world, especially these days with electronic disruptions, emails and internet and all the other things that get in the way of actually focusing on strategy. You can't see here, but just behind my screen, I've got a whiteboard with a sort of a roadmap. But I generally sort of do these sort of annually, though, and I probably not regularly enough. I think, as you mentioned there, accountability is probably another big part of it. If you're actually sharing those goals with people, that's probably makes them more likely to be achieved, as well as writing them down. One of the things that stood out from the book, which stood out to me, was that the three elements that fuel strategic planning, the 3 C's, I think, as you summarize them. In short, creativity, clarity, and consensus. So tell us a little bit about those 3 key elements.
Mm-hmm. So as we've talked about before, creativity is essential to strategic planning. You are looking into a future that doesn't yet exist. So we do need to apply our imagination to ask what if all the time. So asking what if helps you imagine, greater success and set higher ambitions. It encourages you to sort of get a broader perspective as well, because you're wondering out loud about things which haven't happened yet or might happen or might not happen. So it helps you think more creatively. When it comes to clarity, I actually think this is the underappreciated element of successful strategy, because sometimes we get so wound up in how, some of these ideas are so complex when you're trying to juggle all these different elements of a strategy. But actually being clear about what's most important and what are the elements that are going to have the biggest impact on achieving your strategy or on preventing you from achieving your strategy, that's gold. Because, a laundry list of things and ideas is nothing if you can't narrow it down to what matters most, like what's going to have the biggest impact. And again, that also leads into consensus. If you're doing strategy with a group of people, it's really easy to walk out of the room with very different ideas about what's been agreed in the room, unless you've got that clarity by the end of the day about what are the big things we've agreed to and what are the next steps we're going to take to bring them to life. So getting genuine consensus in a room is one of the most powerful elements of strategy, because we've all been in those sessions where it gets to like 4:45 and there's still all these dot points, all these ideas, and everybody's just like, but drinks are at 5, like we've got a quick, let's just say, okay, we'll capture all this and off we go. That's not a successful end to a strategy session. You want to be able to walk out with that elevator pitch about, we talked about these are the big issues we talked about. This is our primary objective. This is what we all have agreed that we want to achieve. And these are the big 5 steps or 3 steps or whatever it is. These are the areas we're going to focus on to bring it to life. And that clarity and consensus, so that people literally walk away and they're able to tell their teams what you've decided. They're able to explain to their teams why it's important and why it's the right move forward. That's just incredibly important.
So you come away focused on what matters most. I think it almost goes back to the old 80-20 rule, doesn't it? I think it's all too easy to get to waste half of a strategy planning session or planning day on stuff that it actually isn't that important. If you can start with the big creative ideas, thinking, generate those great ideas, then consider the risks and, as you said, the what about questions. But as you said, I think it's so important to come away with a focused commitment on what matters most. I was just minded of that scene in The Office, which you may have seen, where everyone's like, "But it's drinks at 5," And I think I might have been one of those people guilty of that towards the end of the day, losing focus. But as you say, I think you need to come away with something that everybody is focused on and committed to. The last couple of years, or 2.5 years now, probably, there's been a heck of an impact from the pandemic. Are you seeing any changes now in terms of strategy from, I don't know, things like people working from home more, or the isolation, or I guess just the heightened uncertainty? Is that changing the way that people look at strategy?
Yeah, look, I think it is. And as we talked about before, one of the problems is people are finding it hard to focus on the long term because they feel like there's just so much to do right now and so much uncertainty that they're less confident on sort of looking out to the longer term. I also think that the working from home piece has been interesting. Obviously, like everyone, I had to adapt my business. I'd spent like 10 years telling all my clients that if you want to have the important conversations, you've got to all be together in the same room. And then, of course, we absolutely had to flip that and go, well, we can't do that. How can we make this work remotely? And so we did, successfully adapt strategic planning processes to the online world, but you had to be quite different about it. I never wanted to do a full day Zoom session because people just lose interest. So we broke a 2-day strategy offsite into a 5-day sprint where you did like 2 hours every morning, and we had a prep session the week before, and it was tightly structured and choreographed and quite a different process. So it still worked, but I think more than ever, people are valuing getting back into the room when they can. And I think people are realizing that, once again, if you want to have those important, interesting, creative conversations, you are better, if you possibly can, bringing everyone back into the room. And I think we're going to see, even though people are going to be still doing a lot more remote work, I actually think organizations are now focusing on, okay, well, if we are bringing people together, we've got to make the day really worthwhile. We've got to give people a little bit more time to get used to being together again and working together directly. So we kind of have to go a little bit softly in the first bit. But those important meetings are going to be the ones where you want everybody back in the office.
Absolutely. So, Rosie, we've got a range of listeners on this podcast. We've got CEOs, employees, we've got professionals and tradies and small business owners. And we'll let people know at the end where they should go to get a copy of your book and find out more. But I mentioned that, we do at Buyers, we do 10-year property plans, and some people do those and some don't. If somebody was listening to this and they decided, look, I want to actually make a life plan or a career plan or a business plan, where should they actually start with that process? If they were going to actually map it out for themselves, because I'm looking at my whiteboard and it's not the most structured, shall we say. So if somebody was listening to this and they just wanted to have a crack themselves, where should they start?
Well, start by asking themselves just 5 simple questions. Like, where am I right at the moment? What do I like? What do I love? What am I interested in? What are my skills? What are my resources that I've got right now? Then where do I want to get to? Set a time horizon. Choose your own time horizon. If you're not confident setting a 10-year plan, go shorter. Test it out. Do a 3-year to start, or even a 1 year if you're really feeling not confident. So where do I want to get to? Paint that picture of what success looks like for you. I often get people to draw a picture of it as well, because it's amazing how that, even terrible drawers like me, it encapsulates some key elements. And then think about, okay, what's going to stop me? What's going to help me get to that long-term ambition. List out all the hurdles and enablers that will help or hinder you from getting there. Then narrow that down into, okay, so when you look at them, they're often flip sides, hurdles and enablers. So then out of that list, think about, what does that tell me about my keys to success? Come up with 3 to 5 keys to success, the things that if you get right, you will absolutely help move yourself towards success. Then start working out a plan on, well, for each of those keys to success, how can I bring them to life? What do I need to do? Are there new resources I need? Do I need to train differently? Do I need to bring someone in to help me with this? So those sort of key steps along the way, and all the way along that planning process, I encourage people to ask themselves 3 questions. What if? So spend some time imagining what's possible. What about? Look wider, take a wider perspective. Don't just see it from your perspective. Think about, well, if I was I'm a very creative person, but if I was an accountant, how would I be looking at this journey? What else would what other questions would I be asking? And then what matters most? Keep narrowing it down to what are the most important things I need to get right to get to my long-term success. And so it's a very simple, step-by-step framework. I think the other thing I'd probably suggest is don't just do it alone. Strategic planning is always helped when you do it with someone. Now that could be, you obviously work with your clients on 10-year property plans, which is fantastic. It could be your business partner. It could be your partner in life, if they know you're trying to map out either a business goal or a life goal. It just really helps to have someone to share the burden and the excitement of doing that strategic planning.
I think that's where, yes, I do these with my wife, Heather, because I think sometimes, a shared goal can be more exciting and something to, I suppose, inspire you. I do from time to time attend seminars and courses where you do sort of these goal setting exercises. When you're doing that, should you set absolutely huge and unrealistic goals that seem almost unattainable, or do you should you set something that's more realistic? And how often should you revisit? Because I guess the tendency, a lot of those courses, you come away with a nice sheet of paper with a load of goals on, but then it gets stashed away somewhere and not revisited. So how often should you come back to the previous strategy?
Great question. First, on the level of ambition, I absolutely think that depends on the individual. Set your own ambition. If you want to go high and hard and fast, do it. That's great. Own it. But if you don't, if that just stresses you out and you don't feel the need to be a world domination in the next 10 years, then that's okay too. It's your life. It's your plan. Set the level of ambition that you are excited about. On the reviewing it, when you should review it, I would say all the time, because part of being strategic is having those 2 lenses, right? The long-term lens and the short-term lens. So you've got to constantly be reviewing. I would say formally reviewing at least every 6 months about, how far have I gone? Am I really focused on the things that matter? Are they still the things that matter? And am I heading in the right direction? And I also suggest to my clients that, if we've done a big strategy session, we're really clear about what they need to focus on, then almost every work in progress meeting should have at least 5 minutes keeping you honest. Like, remember, there are 3 big things we need to get done this year or in the next 2 years. What's been the progress on these? Just keep pulling yourself back to what matters most all the time, not just at your annual reviews or 6 monthly reviews.
Absolutely. Rosie, thank you so much for your expert insights into strategy and being more strategic. If people want to find out a bit more about what you do and to check out your book or your website, where should they go to find out more?
So if you'd like to find out more about the book, you can go to goforbold.com.au. You can download a free chapter of the book. It's also available through there and on Amazon and Booktopia. If you'd like some resources to do your own strategic planning, just a simple framework, I do have some resources hidden on my website. So if you go to rosieyeo.com.au/resources, there's a couple of free downloads there, some simple templates for strategic planning. And Pete, I love people connecting with me on LinkedIn too, so you can always find me that way on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to nip off now and set the magic behind my powerful strategy and vision. And I've really enjoyed, actually, as a final aside, that one of the examples you used of a great business strategy plan was Guzman and Gomez. I seem to have spent much of the past 10 years eating in that place with my kids, and really interesting insight into the how a powerful strategy and vision like that has reaped such enormous dividends over the life of that business. So yes, a very interesting and successful Australian business story.
Yeah, no, that one's a great one. And it makes me hungry every time I think about them.
Yeah, my kids always drag me along and kicking and screaming. But yes, an excellent business and a great success story. Rosie, thanks so much, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Pete. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.